Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah here. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Aleph, and today we will be completing Daf Pei Amid Beis as well as learning Daf Pei Aleph Amid Aleph. We pick up today on Pei Amid Beis. We are in Siman Nun Gimel, bottom line of the Shulchan Aruch, Sif Beis in the Mechaber. We're continuing to discuss the very fascinating and interesting halachos that pertain to Psukei de Zimra. Says the Mechaber in Sif Beis, Ein loymar yishtabach, you cannot recite yishtabach, ela imkein amar baruch sha'amar, unless you made the bracha of baruch sha'amar, ukitzas psukei de zimra, and you recited at least a little bit of psukei de zimra. Says the Mishnah Berurah on Peyam Beis, Ois Cotton Beis, Ein loymar, says the Chavetz Chaim, this refers bein shliach tzibur ubein adam acher. In this halacha, we're talking about both a shliach tzibur and both a regular person. If you're going to daven psukei de zimra, you can't just say yishtabach without opening with baruch sha'amar, nor can you say yishtabach if you haven't said any of psukei de zimra. The reason the Chavetz Chaim says this is because yesterday we learned Sif Aleph here in Nun Gimel. That was a halacha that was speaking specifically about the Chazan, about the Shliach Tzibur, where the Mechaber said, Omer Shliach Tzibur Yishtabach Mu'umad, that the Shliach Tzibur has to say Yishtabach while standing. Now, coming off that halacha in Sif Beis, the Mechaber tells us, you can't say Yishtabach unless you said Baruch Sha'amar in some of Psukei de Zimra. The Chavetz Chaim points out that in this halacha, we're talking about both a regular person and the Chazan. It applies equally to both. Ois Cotton Gimel says the Chavetz Chaim, El Imkein, you can't say Yishtabach unless you've said Baruch Sha'amar and at least K'tzas Psukei de Zimra. The Chavetz Chaim explains why this is. He says, the Yishtabach hi bracha achroina sheniskena loymar la'achar Psukei de Zimra. What is Yishtabach? So we've explained already several times. Baruch Sha'amar is the opening bracha that we make at the beginning of Psukei de Zimra. Yishtabach is a closing bracha that we make at the end of Psukei de Zimra. And if you look at the nusach of Yishtabach, the Chavetz Chaim points out, as we've learned previously, umascheles b'loy baruch. Yishtabach does not open up with baruch. Why? Ki hi smucha leberchas baruch sha'amar. Because it's considered a bracha smucha lechaverta. It's a bracha that comes on the heels of baruch sha'amar. It's connected to baruch sha'amar. Al kain ein loymar oisa b'loy baruch sha'amar. And that is why you cannot say Yishtabach without Baruch Sha'amar. Now, I'm going to say something that I wasn't thinking about when I prepared this year, but it just struck me now. You know, some of you might be listening, and you might be thinking to yourselves, well, you're telling me that Yishtabach is a bracha smucha lechaverta, and you're saying you can see it's a bracha smucha lechaverta, because it doesn't open with Baruch. Well, you might ask, Baruch Sha'amar also doesn't open with Baruch. Is Baruch Sha'amar a bracha smucha lechaverta? The answer is no. Baruch Sha'amar is not a bracha smucha lechaverta. Baruch Sha'amar does begin with Baruch. What do I mean it begins with Baruch? Well, if you look at the nusach of Baruch Sha'amar begins Baruch Sha'amar v'haya ha'olam Baruch hu, etc., etc., until we get to the words Baruch Paida Ma'umatzil Baruch Shemai. Then we have Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech Ha'olam Hakel Ha'av Harachaman, and then at the end we have Baruch Atah Hashem Melech Muhulal Batish Balchos. The bracha portion of Baruch Sha'amar really begins with the Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech Ha'olam. And we learned this really already previously, because we learned the halachos previously about being masik in middle of Baruch Sha'amar to say Amen on various brachas. And when we learned that halacha, we learned that all applies after you say Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech Ha'olam. And the Chavetz Chaim told us that from the beginning, from Baruch Sha'amar until Baruch Atah Hashem, that is all shvach ba'alma. That's just praises of the Rebbeinu Shalom. But the bracha portion really begins Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam. So that's the opening of the bracha. Yishtabach doesn't have Baruch at the beginning of Yishtabach. It doesn't have Baruch until all the way at the end. Baruch atah Hashem Keil melech gadol batishbachos keil oidos. That's so it's a bracha hasvucha lechaverta. That's why it doesn't have to begin with Baruch at all. Okay. So again, we're here in Ois Katan Gimel on Peyamid Beis. So the Chavetz Chaim said that you can't say Yishtabach unless you said Bar Sha'amar. Why? The Yishtabach Yibrach Achroinish and Iskan Aloy Malacham Sukkah de Zimra Umascheles Beloy Baruch Yismuch Leberchas Bar Sha'amar. Al Kain, therefore, Ein Loymar Isa Beloy Bar Sha'amar. You can't say Yishtabach without saying Bar Sha'amar because you're saying half a bracha. It doesn't have a psicha. It doesn't have an opening. A bracha has to have a psicha and a chasima, and this doesn't have a psicha. And says the Chavetz Chaim, v'loy katayin, and not like those who make a mistake, and they think shekishehem baderech, that if they're traveling and they need to abbreviate their davening, oy shar shasat chak, or they're in some other kind of pressing circumstances, maschilin mi yishtabach, they can start their davening from yishtabach. Shemavarchen al yidei zeh bracha levatala. That would be a bracha of HaTorah. Why is it a bracha of HaTorah? Because you're saying Bar Sha'amar, which is a closing bracha on Psukkah de Zimra, and you didn't say any Psukkah de Zimra. And it's also an incomplete bracha because you didn't say Bar Sha'amar. Ois Katan Dalid, Amar Bar Sha'amar, Al Kain, because of this halacha, Avel a yard site. Somebody who's in Avelus, and therefore he's davening for the Amud, or somebody who has a yard site, and he's a chiyuv, and he's going to daven for the Amud. So you have an Ovel who needs to daven chakras for the Amud, or a chiyuv who needs to daven chakras for the Amud, and he comes to shul late, and he gets to shul very, very close to Baruch Hu. He has to daven for the Amud, and when he davens chakras for the Amud, he needs to start with Yishtabach, right? Because we learned already, and the Chavetz Chaim says it here, Ki also lahafsik bein Yishtabach lekadish. You're not allowed to make any hefsik between Yishtabach and Kaddish. That's why we said yesterday that the Shliach Tzibor has to stand for Yishtabach. That way he's already standing. So he says Yishtabach, and right away he says Kaddish. And he doesn't have to be mafsik by taking a minute to go stand up and go to the Amud. So this fellow is a chiyuv, he has to daven for the Amud. He can't just walk in and not say any psukkah de Zimra, go up to the Amud and say, Yiskadal, Yiskadash, Shmei Rabbah. That he can't do. He says because... so he has to start from Yishtabach. Therefore, says the Chavetz Chaim, Yiru al kol panim loymar mitchila la'atzmam bar sha'amar v'ashrei. So he should make sure that he says bar sha'amar and ashrei, and now he could go to the Amud and start davening for the Amud with Yishtabach. The Chayin achazin b'Shabbos. So too, somebody who's supposed to daven chakras for the Amud on Shabbos, shehisaka lavay ad karev leBaruch Hu, and he doesn't show up to shul until close to Baruch Hu, Yiral kol panim loymar mitchila la'atzmai bar sha'amar v'ashrei v'nishmas. The Chanal b'Siman Nun Beis b'Mishnah Berurah Sif Katan Hey, where we saw that on Shabbos, the minimum abbreviated psukkah de Zimra is bar sha'amar ashrei nishmas and yishtabach. So basically, he's saying like this. The Chazan has to start with Yishtabach. Now, there's two reasons that the Chazan has to start with Yishtabach. One is you can't say Kaddish going back on nothing. Kaddish has to go back on something. It has to go back on Psukim, it has to go back on Divrei Chazal, it has to go back on Tefillah, it has to go back on something. So you have to say Yishtabach before you go ahead and say Kaddish. Now, the words of the Mishnah Berurah over here are, Umechrachim lamed al kol panim loyma yishtabach lifnei ateva, ki also lahafsik bein yishtabach lekadish. That phrase took me by surprise. Let me just take a look here. One thing, bear with me for 1 second, please. I'm just struggling. What exactly does the Mishnah Berurah mean here? You have a chazan, you have a chiyuv, he's a chazan. He came to the Beis HaKnesses late, he came close to Baruch Hu. He has to start from Yishtabach. Ki osar lahafsik bein Yishtabach lekadish. Because you're not allowed to make a hefsik between Yishtabach and Kaddish. What's troubling me is, it seems to me that the reason the Chazan has to start from Yishtabach is because you can't say Kaddish without Yishtabach. Because if you say Kaddish without Yishtabach, it's not going back on anything. Why does he say that the reason is because you can't be mafsik? Let's say the Chazan came close to Baruch Hu, so he wants to go up to the Amud without saying any Psukei de Zimra. And he wants to just start Yishtabach. So what does he mean you can't be mafsik? All right, I'm a little puzzled by that phrase. Let me see what my brain churns up while I'm saying the shir. Okay, meantime we'll go weiter. Top of Pei Aleph Amud Aleph Siv Gimel the Mechaber. Says the Mechaber. Ein levarech ala tifas tzitzitz. You're not allowed to make a bracha on putting on a talis, bein psukei de zimra liyishtabach, between psukei de zimra and yishtabach. So let's imagine for a second, somebody wants to put on his talis. For whatever reason, he didn't put on his talis yet. And he finished Az Yashir, and he's about to start yishtabach. So really, he has finished reciting psukei de zimra. He's up to yishtabach now. Says the Mechaber, you can't put on a talis now. You can't make the bracha and put on the talis now. Continues the Mechaber, Ella ben yishtabach liyoitzer. If you're in that position, say yishtabach, and then make the bracha and put on the talis after yishtabach. And the Ramah says, V'ayin lekamon simin nun daled sif gimel. Now let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. What's going on here? Says the Mishnah Berurah is cutting hay. Ein levarich. Says the Mishnah Berurah, let's say the reason this fellow's not wearing a talis is because he forgot to bring his talis to shul. So he doesn't have a talis. Nope, he doesn't have a talis. He started davening without a talis. He finished Az Yashir, and now somebody brought him a talis. The Shamish came and said, oh, you need a talis? Here's a talis. Still in all, you cannot make a bracha between the end of Psukei de Zimra and the bracha of Yishtabach. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Va'af shehu ben haprakim, even though technically, when you finish Az Yashir and you're up to Yishtabach, you're at a place in the davening which would be called Bein HaPrakim. Remember, we learned about Emtza HaPerek and Bein HaPrakim. Be'emtza HaPrakim is when you're in middle of something. Let's say you're in middle of one of the halalukas. So then you're in middle. You're Be'emtza HaPerek. You're in middle of a perek. The halachos of being mafsik be'emtza perek are much more chomer than the halachos of being mafsik bein haprakim. Let's say between one halaluka and another halaluka. Well, over here, when you're between Az Yashir and Yishtabach, technically that constitutes bein haprakim. And bein haprakim is always more kal. It's always more lenient to be mafsik at that point. Still in all, says the Mechaber, you cannot be mafsik to make the bracha on your talis between the end of Psukei de Zimra and Yishtabach. Why? Explains the Chavetz Chaim, Kevan bracha koya Psukei de Zimra, because since you're about to make the bracha of Yishtabach, which is a closing bracha on Psukei de Zimra, ein roy sheyehi hefsik beinam lebein bracha achroina didu. You can't be mafsik between the Psukei de Zimra that you're making the bracha on and the bracha of Yishtabach. It's kind of like being mafsik between making the bracha of al natilas lulav and picking up the daled minim. You can't be mafsik between making a bracha and a mitzvah. So too on the back end, you can't be mafsik if the bracha of Yishtabach is a closing bracha on Psukei de Zimra. Then the same way you can't be mafsik between Bar Sha'amar and starting Psukei de Zimra, you also can't be mafsik between the end of Psukei de Zimra and the closing bracha of Yishtabach. The bracha re'uya lihiyai samach lahamitzvah, because the bracha has to come immediately following the accomplishment of the mitzvah. Aval mikoidem lazeh, but let's say they bring you the talis not between Az Yashir and Yishtabach. Let's say they bring you the talis smack dab in middle of Psukei de Zimra, right? You're somewhere in middle of the halalukas, and now you get a talis. Could you make a bracha lehisatef patzitzitz and put on the talis then? Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ava mikoidem lazeh b'Psukei de Zimra al kol panim bein haprokim yeniach hatalis v'yavarech. If you're bein haprokim, let's say between one halaluka and the next, over there you could make a bracha and you could put on the talis. Umikol shkein le'inyin tefillin, certainly you could put on tefillin. Why is tefillin a kol shkein? Why is it a kal v'chomer? If you could make a bracha to put on a talis, you could definitely make a bracha to put on tefillin, because tefillin is a mitzvah haguf. It's a chiyuv haguf. You have a chiyuv to put on tefillin every day. Talis is not a chiyuv haguf. Talis is a chiyuv beged. If you're wearing a beged that has talon kanfos, you're mechuyev to put tzitzits on the beged. But you don't have to. Technically, you don't have to wear a talis. So, if you could make a bracha of lehisatef patzitzitz to put on a talis that you're not really mechuyev to wear in middle of Psukei de Zimra, certainly you could make a bracha on tefillin. The mutter levarach alein bein haprokim. So, bein haprokim in middle of Psukei de Zimra, you could make a bracha to put on a talis or a tefillin. Ubefrat emu barabim. Certainly, if you're davening in a shul barabim, umispayish leishe b'li talis utfilin, and you feel funny standing there without your talis and tefillin and davening, people are going to keep coming over to you. How come you're not wearing a talis and tefillin? So then already covered abrius is involved, and then certainly you can make a bracha. Okay, so far, let's just do Mishnah Berurah's cut and vav. Tzitzits fuhadin linyin tefillin el yarabba. We're not talking about only tzitzits here, talis. We're talking about tefillin also. Now, so far, what we see over here is the Mechaber told us a halacha. You have to put on a talis or tefillin in the middle of davening. You cannot do it between the end of Psukei de Zimra and Yishtabach. So you can't be mafsik with the bracha between the end of Oz Yashir and Yishtabach, because Yishtabach is the closing bracha on Psukei de Zimra. You can't be mafsik between Psukei de Zimra and the Yishtabach. What could you do? You could wait until after Yishtabach, even though we're makpid not to be mafsik between Yishtabach and Baruch Hu. Still in all, if you're stuck and you have to put on your talis, if you have to put on your tefillin, you could put it on then. You could be mafsik and make the bracha then. What if you want to put on the talis in middle of Psukei de Zimra? You're allowed to do that bein haprokim. If you're in one of the break points, bein haprokim in Psukei de Zimra, then you can be mafsik and you can put on the talis or the tefillin. Ois cotton zayin. So the Mechaber said, put on the talis or the tefillin between Yishtabach and Baruch Hu. Says the Mishnah Berurah cotton zayin, bein Yishtabach liyoytzer, kol zehu dafke im loy haya loy mikoidem. Says the Mishnah Berurah, this kula that we're going to allow you to make a bracha on the talis or on the tefillin between Yishtabach and Baruch Hu, that's only if you're an oinus. That's only if the reason you weren't wearing a talis is because you didn't have one. Or, let's say you weren't wearing it because you started davening before the Zman of Mishayakir, so you halachically couldn't make a bracha yet on the talis. And now it came to Zman of Mishayakir where you could put on the talis and tefillin. So then you were an oinus, so you couldn't do it. The lavachi. But if not for that, if you just intentionally, you had a talis, you had tefillin, you just chose not to put them on yet. In that case, says the Mishnah Berurah, the lavachi, gam zeh oser. Then we're not going to allow you to put on the talis or the tefillin between Yishtabach and Baruch Hu either. V'zeu shetzion Ramah v'ayin l'kaman. This is why the Ramah sends us to Nun Dalid Siv Gimel, because I believe we learn over there that this is a knas. Yeah, we'll see it over there. So that's what I know the Rishon Zatzal writes, I believe in the Igris, that it's a knas. It's a din of a knas. You had the ability to put on the talis or tefillin at a proper time in davening or before davening, and you chose not to, you delayed it, and now you want to put it on between Yishtabach and Baruch Hu, which is a place in davening where we are makpid not to be mafsik. Now you're not allowed to do it. We cancel you and you're not allowed to do it. Okay, now we go weiter, second line down with the Ramah. Hagah. Says the Ramah, this halacha pertains to a regular person in shul. Miu hashliach tzibur, the one who's going to daven shachris for the amud. Im loy haya loy talis tchila, if he didn't have a talis available to him earlier, yesatef betzitzitz kaidem sheyaschel yishtabach, he's allowed to be mafsik and make a bracha between the end of Yos Yashir and Yishtabach. Why? Because he doesn't have a choice. He can't wait until after Yishtabach because he has to say Kaddish. He has to say Chatzi Kaddish. And he can't be mafsik between Yishtabach and the Chatzi Kaddish because the Kaddish goes on the Yishtabach. Explain, says the Ramah, the reason we're going to be makel for the chazan, and we're going to let the chazan be mafsik between Psukkah de Zimra and Yishtabach to put on the talis, if he didn't have a talis available to him beforehand, is because we cannot allow him to do it after Yishtabach, because that would create a hefsik between the Yishtabach and the Kaddish, which we cannot have. Says the Mishnah Berurah, and now again we have a little bit of a funny phrase in the Mishnah Berurah. The Mishnah Berurah says, "De gnaihu latzibur lahamtin alav ben yishtabach lekadish." He throws in another reason here why it is improper for the chazan to put on the talis or the tefillin between yishtabach and kaddish. Why? Because it's a gnai for the tzibur. It's like a tircha de tzibura. What? The whole tzibur should be waiting while he goes in. He goes up to the Amid. Yishtabach shem chalad malkeinu. Baruch atah Hashem. Brachos vaydos ma'atav adolam. Right, then he gets to the end. Kel chei ha'olamim. Excuse me, 1 minute. Goes, gets his talis. Everybody's standing there waiting. That's a gnai. So he can't do it between Yishtabach and Kaddish. But now, the Mishnah Berurah says, the other reason that we already know, V'gam Kaddish koi al Yishtabach. The Kaddish goes back on the Yishtabach. And therefore, it would be a hefsik between the Kaddish and the Yishtabach, which is improper. Al Kain, therefore, Yisatev Tekef Patalis. Therefore, he should put on the talis as soon as he gets it, even though it's between Az Yashir and Yishtabach. V'hu adin batfilin, v'yavarech. So it's interesting to me that he throws in this new reason from the levush of the Gnai Hu Latzibur. Not sure why we need that. Continues the Chavetz Chaim. Ach, im lo yaviu lo atalas ad la'acha shegama yishtabach koidem sha'amar kaddish, yachal la'aniach sham levarech. If the chazan is an oinus, and the pasha didn't bring him the talis until after the end of Yishtabach, now b'di'eved, he can even put it on between Yishtabach and the Kaddish. V'hakol yamtinu, and the killer will have to wait for him. Hayil v'iyefshar b'lavachi, since there's no choice. U'kamoshi yisbar l'kaman b'sayv siman and dalas of gimel ba'agah ayin sham. Okay, let's continue with the Ramah, 3 lines down near the end of the line. V'chein, similarly, im ein minyan b'beis hakneses. If we're waiting in the shul for a minyan, we don't have a minyan. Yamtin hashliach tzibur im yishtabach. So, what's happening is everybody's in shul and they're waiting for a tzenta. So everybody started davening already. So the rest of the people, they could daven the full Psukkah de Zimra, and they could say yishtabach, and then they'll sit down and open a sefer and they'll wait until a minyan comes and the shots could go up and say yishtabach, kaddish, and baruch hu. But the one who's going to daven for the Amud, he should not say Yishtabach. Because if he says Yishtabach, and then he has to wait, then he's going to end up going up to the Amud and starting by Kaddish. Then you have a hefsik between Yishtabach and Kaddish. What's the Kaddish going back on? That's a problem. So that's why the Ramah says, Sim v'chein, im ein minyan bebeis hakneses, yamtin hashliach tzibur im Yishtabach. The one who's going to daven for the Amud should wait before he says Yishtabach. The Yishtoik, and he should be quiet, so he doesn't make a hefsik between Psukkah de Zimra and Yishtabach, Achi Yom Minyan, until the Minyan comes. The Yom Yishtabach the Kaddish, and then he'll say Yishtabach and Kaddish. Now here we have an interesting Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut and test. Yamtin hashliach tzibur, the one who's going to daven for the Amud, should wait, and he should not say Yishtabach. Why? So that he should be able to go ahead and say Yishtabach and Kaddish without a hefsek. I'm just thinking now that the phrase that was troubling me in the Mishnah Berurah earlier, this is what it means. Near the top here in Pei Aleph Amud Aleph in Mishnah Berurah is cut and Daled, right? He says that the one who's a chiv, who's going to daven for the Amud, and he comes late to shul, he should make sure to say, since he's going to have to say Yishtabach when he goes up to the Amud, why is he going to have to say Yishtabach? Ki osar lahafsik bein Yishtabach lekadish. So it was troubling me. Why didn't the Mishnah Berurah say the reason he has to say Yishtabach is because the Kaddish has to go back on the Yishtabach. That's what he means. Ki osar lahafsik bein Yishtabach lekadish. If he goes up and he just starts with Yiskadal v'Yiskadash, so that's the same as making a hefsek between the Kaddish and Yishtabach. In other words, when we use the words that you can't make a hefsek between Yishtabach and Kaddish, what we think of is somebody who said Yishtabach, now he made a hefsek, and then he said Kaddish. What the Mishnah Berurah means up here is the one who's a chiv, who's going to daven for the Amud, he can't just go up and start with Kaddish, because that's the same as making a hefsek between Yishtabach and Kaddish. Just in this case, you didn't even bother saying Yishtabach. But it's the same problem. You can't have a hefsek over there because the Kaddish has to go back on the Yishtabach. Okay, now let's go back to Mishnah Berurah is cut and test. Now I chopped what that earlier Mishnah Berurah meant. Now let's go back to his cut and test. Yamten HaShliach Tzibur, the one who's going to daven for the Amud, we're waiting for the minyan to come. So one person who's going to daven for the Amud, he should make sure not to say Yishtabach. He should wait before Yishtabach, so that he'll be able to say Yishtabach and Kaddish together. Aval hayochid, but the other yichidim who are davening in the shul waiting for a minyan, yarmi Yishtabach miyad. They could say the entire Psukei Zimra together with Yishtabach. There's no problem. V'chein b'Shabbos. So too on Shabbos. Im Gomar Psukei Zimra Kaidem HaShliach Tzibur. A lot of people make this mistake on Shabbos. I see this mistake made very often. Somebody comes to shul, he davens the complete Psukei Zimra of Shabbos, and they stop by Sheichenad. And they open up a sefer, even if they're not being mafsik b'dibur. They sit and they wait. And then when the Shlech Tzibur goes up, Sheichenad Maroim v'Kadosh Shemai. And now this guy gets up, oh, Sheichenad Maroim. No, why are you stopping before Sheichenad? You're in essence, you're making a little bit of a hefsek in your Psukei Zimra. Now it's a hefsek b'shtika, so it's not a terrible hefsek, but you're being mafsik. Why are you being mafsik b'shtika in Psukei Zimra? Finish your Psukei Zimra all the way through to the end of Yishtabach. And then when the Shlech Tzibur goes up, so you'll listen to his beautiful chazanis. There's no Inyan to say Sheichenad together with the chazan. That's not an Inyan. It's a bigger Inyan, finish your Psukei Zimra without being mafsik. And here it's a beferish Mishnah Berurah. V'chein b'Shabbosim, Gomar Psukei Zimra, Kaidem HaShliach Tzibur. If you finish your Psukei Zimra before the chazan does, Yoymar Yishtabach miyad. You should say all the way through to Yishtabach. Oiskan Yud v'Yishtoik, Pirish Alayafsik b'Dibur. V'yuchel lahamtin chatzi shah im Yishtabach. The chazan, who's going to wait before Yishtabach, you could wait even a half an hour. Over here, there's a lot of raid. Does chatzi shah mean literally chatzi shah? They say, yes, it does. You shouldn't wait more than a half an hour between the end of Psukei Zimra and Yishtabach. Interestingly enough, why a half an hour? Guess what? It's brought down because a half an hour is the amount of time the whole Psukei Zimra is supposed to take you. So if you wait more than a half an hour, you waited ad sheyigmar kula. You waited the amount of time it takes to say the whole thing. And that always constitutes a greater hefsek. How many of us take a half hour to say Psukei Zimra? On Shabbos, maybe it takes a half hour to say Psukei Zimra. During the week, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, not more. Okay. Ois cotton yud aleph. And then when the minyan comes, the chazan will say Yishtabach the Kaddish. Ub'diyeved. What do you do b'diyeved? Im gomar gam kein brechas Yishtabach v'achakach bo minyan. Well, let's say everybody that's in the shul, they all davened Psukei Zimra all the way through to the end of Yishtabach. Now the minyan showed up. Now somebody's got to go up to the Amud, and somebody's got to daven chakras for the Amud. The new guy who just walked in is not going to be the one to go up to the Amud to daven chakras. So the Gabbai is going around. He's got to send somebody up to the Amud. But everybody who's eligible to daven for the Amud already said Yishtabach. So now you only have a pool of people who, if they go up to daven for the Amud, they're going to start with Kaddish. But we said you can't do that because the Kaddish has to go back on something. It has to be Samach to Yishtabach. What do you do then? Interesting case. I don't know how many people even thought of this problem. Says the Mishnah Berurah, what do you do? Ubediyevet, im gamar gamkein brechas Yishtabach v'achach po minyan. If everybody already said Yishtabach and then a minyan came, Yomru al kalpanim shloisha psukim mi psuke de zimra. You should pick 3 psukim from psuke de zimra. Asher yeshra v'esech oid yalalucha sela, asher shekach aloi, asher shashem alikav, tihila l'david arabim chalai kayamelech. So you got 3 psukim. The yuchal shliach tzibur lama kaddish. And now the shliach tzibur will say kaddish going back on those 3 psukim. Kibalav hochi lama kaddish. Because without that, you can't say kaddish. You can't say kaddish without that. It's not going back on anything. Since you had nothing for the kaddish to go back on. Very interesting halacha that I don't think is very well known. Okay, fascinating stuff. Now let's go on to Siv Dalid, where we begin to tackle the topic that the title of this Siman was. Right? The title of the Siman was Dina Roy Leirei Liftei Teva. The halachos that govern who is considered Roy to be a chazan, to be a shliach tzibur. Says the Mechaber Siv Dalid. Shliach tzibur tzar sheyeh hagun. Shliach tzibur has to be worthy. Okay? First, says the Mishnah Berurah is cutting Yud Beis. Tzarech. Where does this come from? The Ksiv, because you have a pasuk in Yirmiyah. Matter of fact, I wanted to look this pasuk up, and I neglected to, so we're going to look it up right now. Yirmiyah, Yud Beis, Ches. Yirmiyah, Yud Beis, pasuk Ches. The Rabbeinu Shalom in these psukim, the Navi is talking about the Churban. This is a pasuk in Yirmiyah. So the Navi is talking about before the Churban why the Rabbeinu Shalom is upset with Klal Yisrael. So the Mishnah Berurah brings down the pasuk Tiksiv because it says in Yirmiyah, Nasna alai b'koila. The Klal Yisrael raised up her voice against me. Nasna alai, she came against me b'koila with her voice. Al kain sineisiha, therefore I began to hate her. V'amru Chazal, and the Chazal in Masechtas Tainus say, Zeh shliach tzibur she'enoi hagun. What does it mean that they raised up their voice against me? It means a shliach tzibur who raises up his voice, but al kain sineisiha, and therefore I hate her. Why? Because it's nasna alai. Nasna alai b'koila. This shliach tzibur is using his voice against me. He's a shliach tzibur she'enoi hagun. V'asfarim herichu ma'oid. The Sfarim write extensively. Begoidel genus hamemanim shliach tzibur she'enoi hagun. They write about the shame of those who appoint a shliach tzibur she'enoi hagun. By sending up a shliach tzibur who's not hagun, they're preventing Klal Yisrael from receiving tova from the Rabbeinu Shalom, because the tefillos of the shliach tzibur won't be accepted. Chas v'chalila. Oiskan Yud Gimel hagun. He has to be a shliach tzibur hagun, and the Mechaber is going to start discussing with us who's considered hagun. But first says the Mishnah Berurah hagun. The clothing of the shliach tzibur should be long, so that you cannot see his legs and his feet. I assume, in the context of the way we dress, this means no shorts. Even if you're davening in California or in Florida, where maybe it's perfectly acceptable to wear shorts, it's hot, so it would be a type of beged that a regular person would be permitted to daven in, but the shliach tzibur cannot wear shorts. V'yikanis l'beis hakneses rishain v'yetzei achrain. The chazan should go into shul first, they go out last. V'lo yeh tipesh v'sachol. He cannot be a foolish person. He should be somebody who's worthy of being a shliach tzibur. Who's worthy of being a shliach tzibur? Somebody who can express an opinion and be involved in discussing the needs and the workings of the tzibur. Not somebody who has no business in such things. Toiv lahader shliach tzibur tzadik ben tzadik. The Mishnah Berurah says the we should look for a chazan, a shliach tzibur, who is a tzaddik, the son of a tzaddik, a second generation tzaddik. Why? Ki eina doimet tfilas tzaddik ben tzaddik l'tfilas tzaddik ben Rasha. We see this by Yitzchak Avinu and Rivka Imenu. We see Rashi tells us that Yitzchak Avinu's tefillah was accepted before Rivka's. Why? Because Yitzchak was a tzaddik ben tzaddik, and Rivka was a tzaddikes ben Rasha, daughter of Lavan. I always felt that, so what? Is that Rivka's fault? So why should her the tefillah somehow get second-rate status? I don't think that's what it means. I think what it means is that the tzaddik ben tzaddik knows how to daven better. He was exposed to having a relationship with the Rabbeinu Shalom from a young age. He was exposed to the concept of davening for something from a young age, whereas the tzaddik or the tzaddikes ben Rasha is not used to this. She doesn't know what it means to daven. Omashakasav Rosh, this that you find that the Rosh writes, She'ein Mailos HaShliach Tzibur Tali B'yichus Mishpacha. The Rosh says that the worthiness of the Shliach Tzibur has nothing to do with yichus. I was saying over here, tzaddik but tzaddik is better. So the afilu imihu mi mishpacha bezuya the tzaddik, and the Rosh says even if somebody comes from a mishpacha bezuya, but he's a tzaddik, toiv lekarev mizera rechokim. It's fine. He could daven. Ritzonei loymar. What the Rosh means is gam kein rak she'eno miyuchas. What he means is somebody doesn't have to be miyuchas. He doesn't have to be a person who has fantastic yichus in order to be a chazan. Aval mikamokan ein aviv Rasha. But if somebody's father is a Rasha, that does make a difference. Ein mumin paislim ela b'kehana v'lo b'shliach tzibur. There's no concept of the psul of a mum when it comes to somebody, a physical blemish, to daven for the Yomid. That's something that exists in the Torah by Kehanim, not by a Shliach Tzibur. V'adarabba, and quite the opposite says the Chavetz Chaim. Leiv nishbar v'nitke Elokim loy sivzeh. David HaMelech says in Tehillim that somebody who has a broken, humbled heart, his tefillah is more accepted. So somebody who has a physical mum, sometimes he's taka more brokenhearted, and his tefillah might be more mekubal. However, there are some that are machmer when it comes to this, if there are two equal people, and one is a physical blemish and one does not. And we're going to stop over here. We'll continue next time with the words of the Mechaber Veizeu Hagun. My apologies for missing shir yesterday. I was in Besdin all day yesterday and was not able to prepare and give the shir. So I'm happy we were able to pick up this evening. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The source of limud HaTorah should be Megan on Gans Klal Yisrael. The Rebbeinu Shalom should send Yeshua's refuahs parnasa sheduchim to all those in need, and we should be zocheh to see the bias goyel tzedek b'meher v'yameinu. Amen. Be well.